I was praying before a crucifix, and the Lord explained to me that He was going to give me an experience of heaven. Initially, this was difficult for me because I didn't know what to expect. The Lord brought me deeper into the prayer, and then I heard sounds, and the Lord said, okay, open your eyes. I want you to look. Open your eyes. I could see that I was in a place where there was a stream. I could see that it was clear and that it reflected. And I could understand in a different way how water reflects. I thought, how could I not have seen this before? The sound of the water coming over the rocks produced so many different sounds, and it seemed like I could hear them all at once. And it made it sound like an orchestra. Now you might say, so you were experiencing everything intensely, and I would say, no, it felt very natural. It didn't seem hyper intense. It felt just normal, and yet beautiful. The Lord had goals for those experiences for me, and so He drew me into His goals. Someone would say, how do you describe heaven? And I would have to say, the total absence of any anxiety, any concern, any worry. It felt like absolute safety. But the best part of all of it is the presence of our Lord Jesus. That is different than here because He is like totally present to you. In heaven, as I understand it, there's complete freedom of movement. And there are no separations experienced at all. I initially experienced a valley, which I called the Valley of Solitude, because there was such aloneness in it, such beautiful solitude. You could, in the silence, in the solitude, study everything to your heart's content with God, in union with God. So everything looks different. And after experiencing heaven, when I see natural movement here, as in water or wind or anything like that, I'm immediately brought back to the reality of heaven and the fact that while we experience separation, we are not separated even while we're here. The most profound knowledge I walked away with from the early experiences of heaven were that everything we were taught, everything I was taught as a child was true. Everything that the church proclaims, from what I can see and what I could see, was reinforced. In a sense, it was more simple, but yet more sublime. I was in another place and I saw someone I knew from Earth who had died. And her dying had been a terrible tragedy, for the people left. And so I said, was it terrible for you when you died? Was it horrible? Because it was so hard for all of us. It was terrible. And she said, no, I didn't feel any grief at all because I never really left. This amazed me because the amount of grief we feel when somebody dies from us, and personally, it feels like they've disappeared into an abyss or something, humanly speaking. And for me to understand that when somebody dies, they don't leave us. They have no grief, they have no separation, they experience joy. At the moment of death, all of their pain is stopped. It's over, no pain. When we think of someone who dies, we can get locked into the trauma of their death, the suffering they experienced on their deathbed, or maybe they've died violently as a soldier in battle. And yet, what we have to focus on is that moment when the life ends and eternity begins. If we focus on that for ourselves and those who have gone before us, I think we'll be more content. We won't suffer as much. People have different understandings of a spiritual being and our human being. And at the time of death, we have to think not so much of the body's process of dying, but there's no need for the spiritual person in the world anymore. And so I think of it as this place in my soul that is here. I know God is with me. And I am allowed to go back into eternity for God's purposes and plan. And at the time of my death, what will happen is I won't go out anywhere. I will just close down. And the eternal part of me will go into eternity. And so when we think of someone dying, they're already gone. It's so beautiful. The moment of death is a mystery, and yet a simple thing. It's just a completion. We can't think of the body in the room. We have to think of the person in heaven, in God's jurisdiction, in the kingdom of heaven. And when you die, people think of the death, the moment of death, and they think of, oh, the eyes close, the body becomes still. They shouldn't think that. They should think, the eyes close here, and simultaneously, the eyes open in heaven. So we have to rejoice around the body of a loved one, because their eyes have opened in heaven in the same way that the Lord allowed mine to, prematurely.
When I read Anne's experiences of heaven, the biggest thing that I took from it was that there are no separations, because when someone in my life died when I was a child or a teenager, you kind of think, okay, I'll pray to them a little bit, but I don't know if they can hear me. I don't know where they're gone. And then when you contemplate for yourself, when I die, where am I going to go? If you believe in God or you don't believe in God, you might think, well, just blackness, nothingness when I die. And then you just blank it out and you don't want to think about that anymore. So you go on with your life, but it's always back there as a little bit of a fear that it is this nothingness after you die, and that's terrifying, I think, for anyone. So when I read Anne's experiences of heaven, it made so much sense to me, even logically. You're active in heaven. You'll meet people you love. You'll discuss things that interest you on earth, and then what do you want to go on and learn in heaven? For me, it was life-changing. For the first time, I could kind of get a visual on what heaven will be like.
So in this freedom of movement, I began to move to a place that I called the place where it is a new day. And the reason I called it that is because every time I went there, when I went into it, it was morning. And so I was drawn into almost like a small amphitheater. And in the middle of the amphitheater was Our Lady. And it was a big celebration. And I realized that this was a feast day of Our Lady in heaven. And the feast days we have on earth are being celebrated in heaven as festivals. And there were beautiful purple and white flowers all around the front of where she was sitting. And her movement was different than other people. She was smiling and thanking us because we were celebrating with her. And at one point, she looked at me and I looked back at her, and it's like everything, only she and I were in the gaze. There was nothing else happening. I wasn't aware of anything but her. And then she spoke to me. It was powerful. I don't know what people think, but I don't think they understand the extent of her authority and the power that comes off her. She's not God. but she's the Queen of Saints. And in that moment, she spoke to me, and I could hear her voice like echoing in me, like vibrating in me. It was beautiful. And she said, "What do you want? What can I give to you?" And I thought, there were so many people who needed prayers, on earth. And all these people were going through my head. And so I asked her, I want you to help everybody who's ever asked for my prayers, or anyone who will ask for my prayers. And she said, "Of course, I'll give you this. Yes." I'm moving across this vast distance, and I approach an area with the Lord, and I see a raised bit in the middle, and people are gathered around this. I see that someone is speaking. I know it's Franciscan. And when I got closer, I could see it was a woman. She looked so young, and she was just beautiful, very pure and lovely and light-spirited. She was forthright, she was comfortable, she had lovely dignity, and she was, in a sense, preaching from authority and had great comfort in that. And I was curious to know who she was, and I asked the Lord, "Who is it?" And the Lord said, "It is Claire." And he loves her so much. He admires her so much. He's so delighted about what Claire lived out with him. The people assembled there by Claire were all there to learn and to rest in a concept of Franciscan spirituality that she loved. Now, in heaven, there's no upset or disruption. So my presence there wasn't notable to them, but she did look at me, and I looked at her. And so she acknowledged me directly, and that startled me. But it was so loving that it wasn't uncomfortable, and she said, "Okay, now today we're all going to pray for little Anne because she's having difficulty." What I learned from that experience is that there are like festivals in heaven and assemblies and events that are happening. I didn't realize, I never knew that. I didn't know what heaven was like. And to learn that there were specific gatherings and assemblies to celebrate something was wonderful for me, because I thought, oh, I can't wait to be in heaven and go to one of those assemblies.
People often ask us why we are so convicted in this apostolate at spreading the words that Jesus has given to Anne in the volumes and the other writings that Anne has given us. And I think the number one reason we would give is that we've each been blessed hugely. We've each received so many graces through the writings in the volumes, through the experiences Anne has described in heaven and purgatory. God has moved each of us. He has moved me personally. He has done so much for me through the writings, healed so many of my wounds, assisted me in growth in so many ways. But we've also seen God move so many other people. So many fruits of the apostolate are evident to us throughout the world. We get emails from people who have been brought back to the sacraments, having been away for many, many years. But through that initial contact with Christ through the volumes, experiencing his great love, having a very personal experience of him, they're drawn back. They come back. Simply, I think they would say there was nowhere else to go. One fruit in particular we heard about with regard to the writings was from the family of a man who had died. He, during his last days, read the section in Climbing the Mountain where Anne describes heaven. Now, obviously, he is contemplating the reality of the end of his life being near. And he read that and also heard an interview that Anne did about heaven. And he watched this interview, he watched it many times. He showed it repeatedly to anybody who came in to visit him. It was like from his sickbed, his deathbed, he was evangelizing. and teaching people about the next life. And the family described to us the peace, obviously, that their father had experienced, also their own experience of watching the interview and hearing Anne talk about what she had experienced in heaven. And they talked about the effect in their lives as well, being quite profound, quite deep and quite beautiful. And they contacted us to say thank you and to thank Anne particularly for giving the world and the church this great gift of what is contained in Climbing the Mountain, the description of the beautiful reality, our ultimate hope, that is heaven.
Once I saw a choir in one of the experiences, and Our Lady was up in front, and this choir was made up of all different people from all different nationalities, and as they were singing so sweetly, and they were focusing on using their voices to express love, and I understood it with a depth that I hadn't before. I watched their faces, and they were all so kind and earnest. I remember studying their bone structures because they were different nationalities and from, different times even, but they sang together in unity as this beautiful choir. It was lovely. It was a beautiful, beautiful experience to see and to hear that. What I understood from listening and watching was that there are no separations, no divisions of any sort in heaven between nationalities or peoples, or there's a fellowship and unity that I don't think it would even be possible in time. Maybe it is, I hope it is, that's what we're working toward. But this was no divisions, this was unity, it was love. And I think God showed it to me as his hope for humanity. This is what God hopes for humanity. This is how we should be, universally singing together, expressing love. When you talk about love, the most extraordinary act of love that I can think of is the Passion. People will understand when they go to heaven, the concept of timelessness is such that you can visit times past, you can be there in things that occurred. One time, the Lord allowed me to visit an area where you can be at the crucifixion. The purity of the love that made Jesus, drove him forward into complete condemnation and humiliation. And I don't know if people understand the extent of the humiliation that was levied at Christ. And he received it for each one of us. It's personal. It's as ugly and human as you can imagine that he experienced. I don't know if it was bearable, honestly, because cruelty is so unbearable when it's against anybody, but when it's levied against an innocent, it's not easy to bear. Look at the passions and the people around you. The people around us are living their passions. And we want to make sure that we're not contributing to someone else's wound because we're wounded. We have to receive our wound as Christ received the hurts in his life, and he gave back love. We can receive hostility, and still we're to give back love.
One of the concepts I love from Anne's experiences of heaven, and something she describes for us here on earth, is the invisible reality. So what she says is that that's just the awareness that heaven is always around you, that God is always with you, that the saints are there in heaven praying for us, and if we ask for their intercession, they're rushed to help us in any way they can, that our guardian angel is always with us, and we can ask for God's angels to help us in all different kinds of ways. All of our loved ones in heaven, we can pray to them to help us. We can pray to them to influence a situation or a family member we're worried about. So this is the invisible reality that Anne describes, and I don't know how I ever lived any other way, in the sense that it just gives me such hope. I want that for every person, to have hope.
I think the Lord wants us to live differently, with confidence in his presence. And I saw 3 different people. One was a woman sitting on a bus, and she was looking out the window, and it was raining, and there was water coming down the side of the glass, and she was discouraged. Very sad, very down, very disillusioned by life, and that happens. But God wanted to communicate with her. He wanted to comfort her, and he wanted to draw her away from the mundane and lift her heart, but she was close to him. She didn't have an opening to him. There was no relationship with Christ. Then I saw a second situation, and it was a man, a construction worker, and he was having his own difficulties, financial, marriage, whatever, and he was quite disillusioned and down. And he was watching water come down a cement mixer truck, and water's flowing down it, and the sun came out, and all of a sudden the sun hit the water, and it started glistening in a million different sparkles, and as he looked at it, he recognized God's presence. He knew that God was with him. It spoke to him. He was able to say, God, help me. You know, I want what's right. It was a moment of humility and connection. And then the sun went back behind the clouds, and the sparkling, beauty was gone. But he was consoled. He was strengthened and encouraged. He was content. The third image I wanted to share with you was a sister, a religious sister, and she was cleaning a piazza, like an area. And in the middle of the area there was a fountain. Now there was a lot of rubbish in the area from a festival or a party or something, and she was picking up garbage, cheerfully and joyfully. And then she saw the water from the fountain. It was coming down in 3 tiers. And so she stops to look at the water, and she's enthralled. She's looking at the light and the play of the water, and she's staring, and her heart is so light. And she said, I saw her say, God, I have work to do today, and you want to play with me, but I can't stop and play with you. God, I have to do this work for you. And she was laughing, and she went on picking up the garbage in a joyful mood. Anything she could be doing would be joy, because her relationship with God was so present to her that when she saw the sun in the water, she felt the invitation of God into the relationship in such a joyful, playful way. That's what God wants for all of us. Of the three images, the woman who has no relationship, the young man who has a relationship, and the sister who has a very complete relationship, we should strive for the third, because in it we can do the mundane, we can suffer, we can love, all within the context of a relationship with God. That's why the Lord would like us to live in a heavenly fashion before we get there. It's possible for us.
We're encouraged to reflect upon, to contemplate the reality of heaven. The Lord has told us that there are many rooms in the Father's house and that He would come to take us there. Heaven is the ultimate hope we have as Christians. It's the focus of our Christian hope. It's more than optimism. It's much more. It's about the next life. When we contemplate the ways of heaven and the saints in heaven and their interaction with Christ, we have a model for how we're supposed to behave in this world. If we are focusing on the reality of heaven and the interaction between the saints in heaven and examining and contemplating what heavenly behavior is, it's not with a view to distracting us from the reality of earth and the broken condition we find ourselves and others in, but rather it's with a view to preparing by the behaviors we learn here on earth for the next life. It's about us healing, it's about us getting ready and learning to love each other here in this life in a heavenly manner, in a heavenly way.
We on earth are enduring the mystery of separation from heaven, and we don't know everything, and we can't know everything. And in a sense, that's the arrogance of the time, isn't it? We've been given what we think is a lot of learning, and actually, we've barely scratched the surface. And so, this mystery that we exist in as spiritual beings, that's the real place of prayer. That's the transformative place, to be in the mystery, to be a child of God, to not know everything, to be comfortable that we don't, to acknowledge the depth of our ignorance. The Lord brought me to a room where men were gathered, and one of the men was St. Peter. And I asked St. Peter if these times were darker than the times in which he lived. And he said this: in my time, men worshiped false gods. There was self-will, of course, and sin. The difference between my time and your time, though, is the level of arrogance. Man thinks he is a god. Man is filled with arrogance. The great learning and knowledge is generally not being used to further each other, but to advance self. This is not the way our Lord intended man to live. Changes are coming, which is why you are here. That was important for me to hear, because people always say these times are no different than any other times. There's always been darkness. But St. Peter, drawing my attention to the fact that the arrogance, the level of arrogance is the issue, was very impacting on me. People are happier when they're humble, when they don't feel that they have to be something they're not. So that was important for me to hear. The idea that man thinks he is a god, in particular, struck me. I think what might have happened is that as we developed in psychology, People recognized the truth that came out of that study about the emotional impact of life and about the psyche. And then they made this mistake. They thought because we understand this, we don't need the spirituality, we don't need the church, we don't need God even. They made these sciences into a God. Now, St. Peter also says that this great learning is not being used for God's plan. God's plan wasn't to take us away from our spirituality, it was to integrate our human existence with our spirituality. It's a good thing. This knowledge is we need this knowledge, and God has given it to us. It's a bit like the son going off to college and learning something and then saying, well, now I'm too smart for my father. I know more. He doesn't understand that the father willed the learning for a bigger purpose than the son's ego. In terms of people being tempted against the church, to say, I'm tempted against the church will always be a distortion because we are the church. People have forgotten that the whole point of the church is their individual relationship with God. And so for someone to say, oh, the church, it's all about money, it's all about power, there's a sadness in that, a terrible sadness and grief in that, because what they're missing is that they're spiritual beings created for eternity with God. The spiritual side of them is starving. I think it's difficult to be disappointed and negative if you're thanking God for all of the gifts you have. And I think that's why St. Peter was pointing out, what would God like us to do with the great knowledge that we have? He would like us to weave the knowledge of the, let's say, psychology into our spirituality. There's no conflict. One should not conflict with the other. Truth never conflicts. You can't take truth and have it be in discord with truth. If we weave the true things that God has given us with our spirituality, we're going to have beautiful people committed to God, in union with heaven each day. That's where the renewal is taking us. And that's what St. Peter said. He said, the reason you're here, Anne, is because we want this to change. In other words, St. Peter and those saints were watching me closely to help me absorb these things so that I could accurately represent them. So you're saying, oh, what Anne says is important. That's not true. How you receive this is what's important, both to you and to your family and to the broader church, because we are the church. It will always be a temptation to say, oh, the church has let me down. Not true. God in you will never let you down. A human distortion of God's teaching will disappoint, but God will never disappoint. It will be helpful for us if we discriminate between our spiritualized and our humanized. So any situation can be looked at from our humanity or, the eternal part of us. I had an experience of a young man, and he was a soldier, and he was in a battle situation. And as I looked at him, I could see that he knew he was in trouble. And I knew that he was about to be taken. His life was ending. And he had a dignity about him and a resignation, and he prepared himself to make a move because he had no choice. And yet he strongly suspected this would end in his death. There was no choice, and that's the way things are sometimes. Jesus said, this young man was prepared by me. He said, I've been whispering into his soul for the last 2 days. He knew that I was coming. His parents told him about me. He knew who I was. He understood about me as his Savior and about heaven. The young man knew enough about Christ to call on him and to trust him. And he said, don't feel sorry for him. And he said, because he is in better condition than some of his friends who will survive the day, because his soul is safe. I thought to myself at the time, if his parents knew this, if they had seen what I had seen through God's eyes, they would be so consoled, because they would know that their son had dignity and that he was at peace. He wasn't terrified of death at all. He faced it in a very beautiful fashion with Christ.
Heaven is available to everyone, and it's out there for everyone. Living through your life with an awareness of heaven, and that's where you're headed, takes away a fear of death, because you understand that you and your loved ones and your family, when you die, you're all going to be together in this beautiful place that I suppose we can only dream about, but where there's total peace and a lack of anything hard. That's where the hope is.
If you're truly a spiritual person, you love God's children. And that's the other thing about God the Father. Knowing, praying to Him, what will the fruit be of a relationship with God the Father? A commitment to His children, even if it costs you. And it will cost you. We've been given gifts for each other. In the same way, a mother has an ability to read. She will make sure her children can read. Was she given the gift of reading for herself? Yes and no. She was given it for herself, but not to stop with herself. And that brings me to an experience in heaven of someone named Mary, an unknown saint. I saw a woman, a beautiful woman, in this valley of solitude, and she was standing by the stream. And she began to talk in a very consoling way. And I understood that she was unknown anywhere on earth. She was a regular mother, served her children and her husband. Mary, an unknown saint, had an enormous gift of maternity to share with me because of the mothering she had done on earth. As spiritual beings living temporarily on earth, we can be greatly consoled that our ancestors, parents and grandparents and those who have gone before us are saints with enormous intercessory power. So we should pray to them. They want to help us. And we have to view our deceased relatives in that way, as saints in heaven with God. People might say, well, what does heaven look like? And all I can say is that anytime I think I've had a lot of experiences and I've seen it, I see something different. So it's as different as it is on earth. On earth, everything is finite. It can be fully understood and will be fully understood. In heaven, it's infinite. So it's a difference. An experience I had in heaven was being in a forest. I'm walking down a path slowly in a forest, and wind was moving all of the leaves around me. And that was creating all of this movement, and also sound. And because your senses are so sharp there, you can kind of take it all in a way that we can't here. So this forest with the light and the different light on the different leaves and the action of the wind on all the different leaves, and it was an extraordinary experience, the most beautiful part of which was that Jesus was with me. When a child brings us a picture that the child drew, we're so excited about the child's representation of something. Now imagine studying a forest in heaven without any human burden, the burden of our humanity, the beautiful burden of our humanity. And then studying God as creator. I mean, it will never be finished. And the beauty of heaven is what God has created for us in the geography, but it's in the safety. We're so safe. So imagine being in a place where you'll never be separated from your loved ones again. You'll always be safe. You know that God has you, that He's real, and that's important for people to know, and that's why I want to share this. That's why I'm willing to do this, because I think people should know this. They should have that wonderful anticipation. In a forest area, I began to say to him, I don't want to go back. Life is very hard there. It's difficult for me and for other people, it's not just me. And the Lord said, well, let's look back on your life at a time in the past. And so I was looking back on it as though I were standing on a balcony, overlooking life happening down here. I could see myself and my husband and my children in this time in our life where there was enormous suffering, physical, health problems, and one stacking on top of the other. But that's the way life goes. You have stretches where there's suffering, and that was one for us. The Lord said, now look again. All you're seeing is the suffering. Look again. And as I looked from the Lord's eyes, from heaven's eyes, I could hear my prayers during that time. And my prayers were beautiful. My prayers were, help us, Lord. Help my husband with this cross. Help our children to not be affected because there's physical suffering in the house. Help the people who have to help us. When I looked at the cross from the Lord's eyes, I could see the heavenly view is very different from the earthly view. Now, would I want to go back to that time and suffer all those things again? No, I can't say I would. It was difficult. And yet, I'm grateful that the Lord allowed those experiences for my family, because I can see what happened, what strength and things came from that. So there's a lot to think about for each one of us in our day. You know, we're locked in the present, so to speak, where we need to be in the present, but also with an awareness that Christ is with us and all of heaven is with us also.
We are each called to preach the gospel. We're called upon to be the eyes of Christ to everybody we meet. Christ tells us in volume 2 that when others look at us, He wants us to be so filled with Him that when they see our eyes, they actually see His eyes looking back at them, that we and Christ each become one. And this is the way He wants it for us. This is the experience that He wants other people to have of us. So this is the heavenly way. This is our way of going on. This is what we're constantly trying to practice and become better at, so that we are doing it by habit. In other words, by virtue. We've been given the way, we've been given the heavenly way, and we can find this by study of the scriptures, as the volumes constantly teach us to. We will find it in the volumes themselves, and ultimately it is by this way of the gospel that the world will be transformed.
suddenly I began to move up to, I was able to go up in and out of the trees and up into the sky, into this deep blue of the sky, far, far up. And I could see the universe, the extent of it is limitless. The Lord said, look back. And so I looked down and I could see the earth. It was so beautiful. I was struck by the beauty of it. The Lord's experience of the earth and us is one of great hope. And I remember a different time when I was praying, and mystically I became aware of a woman in prayer. And she was in the back of a church and she was praying. And her prayer was so pure and humble and true. And the Lord said, don't you recognize her? And I looked more carefully, and this was someone who I had prayed for. I'd asked the Lord for her conversion. I'd really prayed hard that she would discover Christ and be healed and happy. Where there's prayer, there's hope. If we're praying for our family members, we have hope. We should be confident that God will take care of them, because He will. He won't let a prayer for conversion of our family ones go unanswered. God will answer those prayers. As I looked at this woman deep in prayer, I realized something, and that is that God craves love and connection with each person individually. All of the experiences I've had, always I come away with a greater understanding of something. You see, they're not just for me. They're for us all to understand a little more about God and His love. And that's why her relationship with Christ gives me great joy. It's not like one relationship with God takes away from another. The closer you are to God, the more you realize how much He loves everybody and craves a connection with everybody. So I think those that really love God will become more and more selfless in bringing others to Him.
It's important for people to be reminded that Anne's experiences of heaven and what she has described are entirely consistent with our teachings of the Church and with Scripture. And a number of years ago, our Bishop Leo O'Reilly of Kilmore Diocese established a commission to examine Anne's experiences and the writings. And this commission consisted of both a scientific and a theological component. So it was a thorough and a vigorous and in-depth process. And a couple of years after that, the bishop granted an imprimatur for all of the writings. So that's been a great help to people. And it reassures people, lay apostles around the world who are spreading the writings, that they can do so with great confidence, knowing that the apostolate and Anne and all of us here have at all times remained in full obedience to our bishop, because we realize that it is the safest place to be, it's the only place to be, and it's where the Lord has put us. So with great thanksgiving in our hearts, we have received what the Lord has given us in the apostolate, and we give it to you and pray that the Lord will bless you as much as He has blessed us.
For a long time after the experiences of heaven, I wondered about what had happened to me. And I wondered, for example, why I was so fixated on the bird flying. I looked up at a bird flying, and he was kind of aloft. He was kind of resting on this breeze. You know, he was coasting on a current. And I realized as I studied him that I was studying God the Creator. Because if God withdrew His will from this situation, the bird would fall to the ground. It could be no other way. The bird is held aloft by God's power. So for example, when I would study the water with such intensity, I realized that I was using 100% of my brain in heaven, and that on earth we're using a small portion, and we're very distracted. But in heaven, we have our full capacity of our brain. So when we look at water, we're studying God. I remember once God allowing an experience for me after Easter. And when I opened my mystical eyes, I saw Jesus sitting outside of a wall. All I saw was a wall, a stone wall. And his face was serene, and he had enormous dignity and presence. And I saw him looking off. He looked off into the distance, and when I looked, I saw the scene of his crucifixion. He was looking at it. And I said, "How do you feel?" Because I wondered how he felt resurrected, looking back on the reality of what he suffered in his humanity. And he said, "I feel like God." Oh my goodness, it impacted me profoundly. That one statement showed me that we will each feel in heaven the same way, not like God, but like the suffering is over. There was value in it. It wasn't random. It didn't land on us outside of the presence of God. That was a very impacting experience for me. We should be at peace with the crosses that will come, because God is in them, and we will be looking back on them. And anybody listening to this has to think of this truth. All they have left is from this moment till the time they die. They will die. This is what's our future. And to say it a nicer way, life eternal awaits each one of us. It's there. It will happen. So we need to think about our days with that truth in our minds. I think we'll live differently.